Hi yogis, and thank you for joining me for this yoga sizzle video. In this deconstructing asana video, we're going to look at one of the most common standing postures, warrior one. In Sanskrit, it's called Virabhadrasana 1. And if you've tried the sun salutations, you'll often have encountered this pose. It's part of sun salutation B from the Ashtanga Vinyasa tradition. And it's a really great pose for opening the hips. It's related to warrior 2, but the main point of difference is warrior 1, the hips are square to the front of the mat. In warrior 2, the hips are opened. So I like to think of warrior 1 as being a little more for the iliacus muscle, which is a slightly harder muscle to target. It's partner muscle to the psoas, and they make up your main hip flexor. Iliacus muscle fans the inside of your hip bone, and it's quite hard to stretch. So this pose can be quite good for getting into that muscle, but it's also really good for building strength into the legs, for grounding you down, embracing that inner warrior. So what does this pose look like? It's again like a lunge with the back heel on the ground. The front knee bends, and the hands will reach up. Sometimes the hands will be together, sometimes the hands will be apart. But this is your warrior 1. So, how do we build this shape? Well, the hips are square to the top of your mat. And that means, to begin with, it might be a very short stance. So, with your hips square to the front, your front knee bends, and in order to bring the back heel to the ground and the legs straight, the toes will need to angle forward a little. So whereas the heel is off the ground in a traditional lunge, the heel is on the ground for warrior 1. And the toes will be angled maybe a lot forward if you're tight in the hips, or more out to the side if your hips are more open. The front knee stacks on top of the ankle and it doesn't go past the ankle. Your hips square, and then the hips are level. The spine is upright. So if you only saw yourself from the hips to the top of the head, you could easily look like you were in mountain pose, Tadasana. And the hands reach up, stretching the spine. So in the front leg, you engage into the buttocks to support the pelvis, and you bend into the leg, and you press down to the foot. And in the back leg, you're trying to extend the hip, but there's no back bend in warrior 1. So if you begin to feel that back bend, you shorten your stance. In the beginning, this might be your warrior 1, and it was for me for a long time. And then as you get more and more open into the hip, as you can keep the spine more and more upright, the pelvis more and more upright, you can take the leg further and further back. And then your arms might need to be forward if you begin poking the ribs up to take your hands to the sky. Again, this will add on a little back bend. So you reach the tailbone down, the pubic bone up, and that in itself will help activate your glutes and give you that nice stretch into the front of the hip. The ribs rein in, and you'll feel that ignite your core muscles. And then you stretch your arms up, and you let your shoulders climb up. When your arms are up above your head, your shoulders want to move up, and this helps to traction and lengthen out the spine. Now, some of the common misalignments that I'll see, I've already covered, and that would be things like adding on a back bend. And often that comes from having too long of a stance, the toes too far out to the side. Because as in warrior 2, when you take your toes out to the side, you externally rotate the back leg, you open out the hips. So then it's a little harder to square off the hips to the front of the mat. And often you'll begin by flaring the ribs, and this disengages your core muscles And then we take the hands up. The hips aren't really square, and they're certainly not going to be level, especially if you want to feel that hip stretch. Keep the pelvis level. Rein in the front sit bone. Make sure the pelvis, the hips face forward. And then stretch up, push down into the feet, reach up through the fingertips. Reining in the ribs, can also help to get the spine even longer. So how can you get into this pose? Well, traditionally, you might come from a downward facing dog position, and then you'll be asked to step the foot forward. Now, if you step your foot all the way between your hands, bring the back heel to the ground, and lift up, for most people, this will be too long of a stance. See how there's a slight back bend? My hips are opening and no longer square to the top of the mat. So instead, yes, you need to bring the foot forward, but maybe it only comes halfway. The heel comes to the ground, and you can have the heels lining up. Some people with very narrow hips might be able to line up heel to arch, but most people will probably find it more comfortable with a slightly wider corridor between the front and the back foot. And that can also help to keep the hips square, give you a little bit more space in the pelvis and the hips. And then you bend into the front leg, stacking the knee, and you anchor down. Notice what it's like. If you have a slight bend in the back knee, it can sometimes make it easier to press into that back foot. And you reach your hands up. Another interesting way to come into the pose is if you stand at the top of the mat and we'll turn the left leg out, turn your left leg out, and notice how far can you externally rotate your leg without turning at the hips. So just externally rotating the leg, keep the hips square, and slowly taking the leg back. Keeping the hips square and level, and keeping that angle of external rotation. So your knees, your toes, your hips pointing in the same direction. If you do it from the back of the mat, again, external rotating the left leg, the hips stay square, and then you explore by inching the front foot forward. How far can you go, keeping the hips square and level, spine upright, and you'll feel this into the front of the hip, your core strong, so really good for helping to build core strength. The lower back nice and full, and then reaching the arms up. So you get a nice full body stretch along the entire left side. And then maybe you return to your downward facing dog, hands to the ground, and you step back. Well, an interesting experiment is if you then start by turning your left heel to the ground and bring your right knee to your chest, how far can you step the right foot without having to lift the left heel? So that's another transition, helping to build core strength, keeping the left heel down, and then lifting the right knee to your chest to step it forward, and then lifting up, hips square to the front and level. And if that means you have to keep the front knee a little more straight, that's fine. And then you slowly, as you get more and more movement into the hips, more flexibility, you can bend the knee more and more. Now, this Warrior One position is really interesting. This is your starting position if you're going to move into things like revolved side angle pose, like that, or moving into revolved triangle pose. They both have hips more square to the front of the mat, so the stance is usually going to be shorter than your Warrior Two for the side angle or the triangle. So play around with this, see how you go with your Warrior One, and I hope your hips love it as much as mine do. See you again soon. Namaste.